All right, Year 12s. So today we're going to look at Lecture 6 in the Causes of the American Revolution, which I've titled Follow-Up Acts. Now, last time we looked at the concept of republicanism, and we did that because it's a concept that helps us synthesize a lot of the concepts that we've been learning so far, specifically the ones that are political, such as natural law, natural rights, the Enlightenment, salutary neglect, British mercantilist policy, life, liberty, and property, etc. We looked at republicanism as a way of helping us understand how the Americans saw themselves in relation to the British monarchy. Today, what we're going to do is identify 4 economic acts that were introduced following the French and Indian War, explaining their causes and triggers, and we're also going to explain the consequences of those acts that follow the French and Indian War. So we're going from the conceptual pre-context of the American Revolution, and now we're really getting to the nuts and bolts. What actually happened? How did this revolution come about? What were the events that took place for it to occur? If you're following in your textbook, you can read page 71 to 76. That will give you some more insight into this lecture. Okay, so in your textbook, it actually says that there are 5 acts following the French and Indian War, and that's technically true. We're only going to focus on 4 because they're all got the similarity or the commonality in that they're all economic. But there was a 5th act, and it's already one that we've been covering. It's called the Proclamation Act, or also called the Proclamation Line, that King George said American colonists aren't allowed to cross the divide into Native American territory, and Native Americans likewise cannot invade or cross the divide, the Appalachian divide, into American territory. That was pretty much to resolve the dispute between Pontiac and the Americans. So that was the first act before all these ones listed that follows after the French and Indian War. And then there are these 4 acts, and they're all economic acts. There's the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Mutiny Act, and the Stamp Act. So the Sugar Act, or what was technically called the American Revenue Act in the British Parliament, was passed in 1764. And the main cause of the Sugar Act is the idea of British mercantilist policy. This policy that comes up time and time and time again is one of the leading causes of the Sugar Act. Now, the triggers of the Sugar Act are such that during the French and Indian War, it became really easy for the Americans, especially the smugglers and the black market Americans, to no longer or avoid the British mercantilist policy that merchants had to trade with the British. Because of the whole war going on, it became a lot easier for the American merchants who were dealing in the black market to kind of go under the radar and start trading with the French West Indies, who were a lot closer to them compared to the British, and thus made it a lot easier to trade with. Another trigger of this was that Britain pretty much wanted to protect trade links with America. So as you could imagine, Britain has put in this policy telling the Americans, you have to trade with us. During the French and Indian War, the Americans stopped trading with the British as much as they did. And so the Sugar Act comes in to try and stop that from happening and to re-establish the trade links between Britain and America. So what were the consequences of the Sugar Act? Pretty much a reduction on the importation tax of foreign molasses. And molasses is a type of sugar. So Britain says, we're going to reduce the tax on our molasses, so it'll become cheaper for you guys to import, and therefore, in their heads, it will become more desirable than the French molasses that they were currently importing from the French West Indies. So Britain have reduced the tax, hoping that America will then turn around and say, okay, well, we can get the molasses much cheaper from the British. Let's keep trading with the British. But the Americans don't get everything for free. Okay, the British say, we're going to do that, but we're also going to introduce a new tax on wine, coffee, spices, and cloth because you guys have been trading with foreign traders, which you weren't supposed to do. And if you want to continue doing that, then we're going to tax you guys. So every time one of those products comes in, we're going to make sure that we benefit from it ultimately. And so despite the fact that the Americans are escaping having to, or despite the fact that Americans are overriding the British mercantilist policy, the empire is still receiving some money in return for the Americans buying wine, coffee, spices, and cloth from other traders. And then the last consequence of the Sugar Act is this idea of writs of assistance or random search warrants, which was kind of just tagged on to the end of the Sugar Act, where the British said, just to make sure that everything's going smoothly and that you guys are doing what we want you to do, we are going to send random British troops that are left over from the French and Indian War into merchants' houses to make sure that there is nothing sus going on and you guys are doing what we want you to do. And obviously, if you had a random person coming up and knocking on your door and just storming into your house and, searching it, that wouldn't really please you. And so the Americans didn't really look at this as a great thing, but they were benefiting in other ways, such as the lesser tax on molasses. Then there was the Currency Act that got passed shortly after the Sugar Act. And the Currency Act is interesting because it's actually a product of this key concept called bullionism. This idea that the wealth of a nation or an empire can be based off how much gold, silver, and foreign coin it possesses in its bank. And so the British Empire kind of justified its power within the global empire based off how much gold, silver, and foreign coin it possesses. And, it kind of explains why they have British mercantilist policy in the first place with the Americans. They want to gain as much out of the Americans as possible in money because of this idea of bullionism, and they want to make sure that the other empires, such as the Spanish and the Dutch and the French, aren't as wealthy as them. Unfortunately, though, for the British, in trying to reap the rewards, the economic rewards of North America through the French and Indian War, they spend a lot of money on the war itself, and they actually plunge themselves into economic decline. The question, though, for the British is, they're struggling, but why isn't America struggling? Why is America still afloat economically? Why aren't they coming to us for cash? Because, if we're struggling, then they would be struggling, but they're not. And it turned out that the Americans were being a bit shifty, and they were creating what's called colonial scrip. Benjamin Franklin describes it as a separate currency system that was unique to the colonies, that was created based off supply and demand. So when America required money, it would create its own money called colonial scrip instead of petitioning the empire for more money, for more coin, or trading with with the British Empire on a more regular basis. And so that is alarm bells for the British. They kind of realize, no wonder we're struggling. The Americans are using their own currency system over here and they're not supposed to. So the Currency Act is brought in. And what that pretty much does is shut down the whole colonial scrip process. There's no more printing of colonial scrip. And so the Americans become indebted economically to Britain. They have no option but to use British currency. Subsequently to this, Britain then calls in the debts that American merchants owe to Britain. And because America doesn't have much gold or silver, and they were relying on colonial scrip, which no longer exists, the American merchants just end up going bankrupt. Well, a lot of them do, not all of them, but a lot of them end up going bankrupt because of this, because they can't pay the debts back to Britain. And so obviously that really irritates a lot of American colonists because their businesses go bankrupt. And so that's the Currency Act. And you can kind of see as we go through these acts how Americans could start to get a little bit frustrated with the British Empire. Then we've got the Mutiny Act, or what the Americans called the Quartering Act in 1765. Again, the main cause of this was Britain's struggling economy. So when the French and Indian War concluded, it was up to Britain to take its troops back into the empire, or back to Britain, and kind of help them with their living expenses, so housing, food, accommodation, etc. But because Britain was struggling economically, and they could see that America wasn't struggling economically, and also because they thought, well, the troops were saving the Americans, not necessarily us. They think maybe the colonies should be contributing to the war effort a little bit. They've kind of got off scot-free here. They've gotten land because of our forces, but now we have to pay for the forces. So maybe they should pay for some of the war effort. And that's the main trigger. And so the consequences of the Mutiny Act is that the British actually leave some of their military, which are called standing armies. And that's a key concept. You guys have to make sure that you have that down in your books, in your glossary, standing armies. The British leave the standing armies in America and say to the Americans, you're paying for their livability. We'll take some of our military back, but we're going to leave quite a lot of them there too. And whoever we leave there, you have to take care of them. Obviously, the Americans aren't very happy about this, and because obviously, they have to accommodate the British military for free. And it starts putting some question marks over a few things. First of all, why are we paying for the British military? Second of all, why are the British military here in the first place? Why don't they just go back home? Why is the empire insisting that they stay here and, conduct random search warrants? And so all these kind of question marks start popping up all over the place for some of what will become the revolutionary leaders, saying, this just doesn't sound right. It doesn't look right. The troops are here. They're kind of invading our territory a little bit. And we're having to pay for them to be here. It just doesn't make sense. And that is the consequence of the Mutiny Act. This big kind of question mark over the relationship between the Americans and the British. And that kind of snowballs into our final act, which is called the Stamp Act. And this is notorious. This is a big deal for us in our revolutionary narrative. You guys have to become super fluent in understanding what the Stamp Act is. Again, the cause of the Stamp Act is Britain's struggling economy. Post French and Indian War, Britain can't balance out its economic expenses. Okay, Britain reaches out to the colonists for help once more. And the trigger is that in the past, Britain have used these stamp taxes or stamp duties on products, like the duties that they're putting on wine and coffee because of the Sugar Act. Britain has put these taxes on the colonies before, and so they turn around and say, why don't we introduce a Stamp Act? And that will help us gain more and more revenue from the Americans, because what it ultimately does is that it taxes every paper product that the Americans use. Receipts, newspapers, letters, anything that uses paper has to be stamped by an official seal of the British Empire. And that official seal costs money, therefore every paper product becomes more expensive for the Americans. Merchants suffer the greatest out of this because, they use things like receipts on a daily basis. And so, they pretty much they're at greater risk of going bankrupt or shutting down because they can't trade anymore. They're forever paying this stamp tax on their paper. So they're at a great risk of this happening. And what comes out of this are these two bottom dot points, which I'm not going to go into right now. That's going to be our next lecture. But it's good to know where they come from. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty are a product of the Stamp Act. They're these guys, these sons, mostly the merchants who are at great risk of going bankrupt or shutting down are these Sons of Liberty who stand up and start violently acting as a mob, completely going against what the British Empire are asking them to do because of this Stamp Act. And also the phrase, no taxation without representation, comes into play. That phrase is very key. Make sure you highlight it. It's the idea that when the Stamp Act got passed, it got passed in Britain, and Britain Parliament had no representatives from the American colonies in it. And so it's very easy for Britain to just say, we're struggling economically. America's not. We need more money. We can get it from America. Why don't we tax America? Great. And so they passed this Stamp Act without any American colonists kind of having the opportunity to try and stand up for themselves. And so that's where the idea of no taxation without representation, no American representation, was heard from when this Stamp Act got passed in the first place. And we're going to hear that idea, no taxation without representation, time and time and time again. So that's pretty much the Stamp Act. Next time, we're going to continue looking at the Stamp Act, the direct consequences of the Stamp Act, specifically the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and the idea of no taxation without representation. If you've got any questions, post them in the Google Classroom. I'll be happy to answer them or bring them to class and we'll discuss them in person.